Greetings, everyone. Happy New Year and happy, let's see, just have a blessed New Year. And hopefully, it will be less of the chaos. But I think that may take a little more longer time. But we're just wishing that it would be something that we wish for everyone and not just for us who are not directly involved or living in those forever war zones. Okay, and so we always think of the people who needed also help. At least the best help we could, I guess, is trying to understand and learn more about what truly is happening and how we can help, especially when it comes to our emotions, because our emotions are frequencies, and if we get overwhelmed and don't have expand our knowledge and understanding, then we might become enemies to our neighbors who might have some relatives to those war zones area. So it's very important that we become so mindful in 2025, because it will be a fantastic year of changes, and hopefully changes that will benefit most people. So welcome for today's podcast, and we are really glad that Vanessa Billy can come back to us. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back on.
And see, for most of you, you've heard Vanessa, and if you follow her, then you would have known that she's always been risking her life, her career for 5 years or more now, supporting people who truly needed support in every way that's possible. And Vanessa, I know that you have been on different podcasts and interviews since December. So I guess I'll let you decide how you want to start this conversation, because I know it could be tiring to let people know what truly happened in the last more or less 3 weeks of your life and of the Syrian life. So help us understand that. Well, one thing that I do know from your recent article, and you've had those two recent articles, is and please follow Vanessa in her Substack, okay? And also in her, you can subscribe there and donate at Patreon. But their recent articles is the Syria, a fallen civilization that will rise again, and that really touched my heart. I said maybe this would be the conversation that we could focus. And then the follow up um, newsletter that she posted is about Malula. And wow, those are again another fantastic article. And most of us don't really know much about Syria. So, in my understanding, but when I was reading Vanessa's Substack, especially on the last two, it's like I'm having a picture of Syria's history and reality, like a beautiful tapestry of diversity and significance to the entire world population. And when it's a beautiful tapestry, sometimes there could be some, maybe you think there are some fabrics or strands that are a little loose, and that's how I look at it. And Vanessa, you also mentioned in your article here about a beautiful thing that you said, but that the Arabs are people united by bands of blood, soil, and language. And I think you quoted that from Sati al-Husri, and long before the advent of Islam. So that's really, for me, that again is a significant statement, because most of us, or most of our audience who don't really study a lot, think that when they hear the word Arabs, it's equivalent to Islam or Muslim. So it's like there's no like differentiation anymore. So please lead us to this conversation. And if you want to assure people that you're safe, please do so.
Yeah, I'm safe. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Syrians still inside Syria that are definitely not safe and who are being targeted by sectarian executions and killings and massacres and ethnic cleansing that is simply not being reported by the journalists that are now, let's say, in huge numbers on the ground inside Syria, because of course now the CIA, MI6, Mossad, MIT, Qatari operation to topple the Syrian government and to end secularism in Syria has been successful, finally, after 14 years of a war of attrition against the Syrian people, which of course included successive barbaric economic sanction regimes or coercive, collective coercive measures, let's call them that, because sanctions always makes them sound much too kind of anodyne and unimportant. But the reality is, of course, they are designed to crumble a country from within, to deprive the people of their dignity, their human dignity, of their resources, of their ability to survive, and ultimately to lose hope and to fall into despair. And of course, that was the entire project by the US once they'd lost the military operation against the Syrian government, people, and the military. So I'm safe, but there are many, many Syrians whose deaths and torture and abuse is going very much unreported, particularly among minority sects inside Syria, including Christians, Alawite Muslims, Shia Muslims. And as you rightly said, you know, most people here in this region, they see it more as an Arab war of liberation that's been ongoing since the Crusader times. Like, this is effectively for them the Neo-Crusader campaign to occupy and destroy West Asia or the Middle East as we know it in the West. And the sectarian divisions, if you look at anything, like if you look at Iraq, if you look at Libya, if you look at Syria, if you look at Yemen, those sectarian narratives never existed. It was kind of considered rude by most Syrians to actually ask their friends or their neighbors whether they were Alawite or Shia or Sunni. This was not something that people even took into consideration. And now we're seeing a return to this. We're seeing people being captured, and the first thing that they're being asked is, where are they from? When they reply to where they're from, then they become Alawite pigs, or Alawite in Arabic, Khanzir or Nusairi, which is the kind of derogatory term for these sects that are now being persecuted inside Syria. So the history of Syria for me was incredibly important to maintain, because what we're seeing now is a kind of hideous postmodern 21st century evolution in Syria, which has plunged it into its darkest age so far, actually, despite its centuries of rule by various empires and its division by Sykes-Picot, by the British, by the French Mandate, and so on and so forth. There has been endless interference, particularly in Syria, because of its geographic importance and its historical importance to the region. And so therefore, I just felt it's important for people to understand that this is just one more phase in this attempt to bring these peoples under control, but it isn't going to work. It isn't going to happen. Once the initial shock wore off, people were already starting to think about how they can resist, how they can push back. And this is something you're never going to change. Right now, Syria is really plunged into an abyss. And when I'm talking to people inside Syria, like a friend said to me yesterday, Vanessa, I feel like I'm schizophrenic. Like at one point, I want to leave the country because this is not my country anymore. This is not the country that I fought for 14 years. This is not the country that I love. This has been turned into something else. But then the other side of him is saying, no, 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 you have to stay. You can't leave this country because it's your country. And so therefore you have to adapt to the current situation in order to get through it, in order to find a way to fight back against it. But people are terrified, absolutely terrified, whether they were for the president, against the president, for the government, against the government. They're terrified because there's a lawlessness now. And the ruling body, which is formerly Al-Qaeda, formerly ISIS, which is now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, can't control it. They don't have the forces on the ground to be able to consolidate power and to be able to control the gangs that are now roaming through Syria and carrying out these revenge killings, or simply these ethnic sectarian massacres, which they were doing for the last 14 years, right? So there's no difference, and 50% of the forces on the ground are foreign. They're Uyghurs from China, from Chechens from Chechnya, Turkmenistans, Uzbekis, all nationalities from all over the world. There's a map from 2014 which shows the armed groups, or the armed group members, were coming in from virtually every country in the world, including Western countries, of course.
That's really very sad and to hear, especially when you mentioned that all those years they've been fighting for this, and then the fall was from within. What does that really mean? Can you explain more in details what it's from within? Because most of us also know that there's always that external interference or invasion. In fact, I was just looking at your recent post, and although this is in 2017, it's in the picture says US provides military assistance to 73% of world's dictatorships. And for most Americans, this is so hard to accept, or to even go into the depths of it. But what is that happened within Syria that brought it to this situation?
There's a lot of rumors circulating, particularly about the fact that the high command of the Syrian Arab Army betrayed the army and all of them surrendered. I can categorically say that this is not true, because people need to remember that I was on the ground. I actually went close to Hama before the battle came from Hama, which is in the north on the border with Idlib. And then to Homs. I was on the road between Hama and Homs during those battles. And I can categorically say that when Aleppo, let's say, fell, there were Syrian Arab Army brigades still fighting to the east of Aleppo, and it was the Russian command that actually left them on the battlefield and went back to Haimamin. And the Iranian reinforcements also saw the Russians leaving and asked them why they were leaving. They said, well, we're not staying. It's not our fight. We're going back to Haimamin. Those brigades of the Syrian Arab Army kept fighting until they reached the south of Aleppo, when they actually liberated civilians that had been evacuated from the Shia villages to the northwest of Aleppo, Nubla and Zara, that had already witnessed sectarian massacres back in 2016 at the hands of the same groups that were now invading Aleppo and threatening Nubla and Zara again. They had been trapped to the south of Aleppo alongside military cadets and other civilian groups and military security groups that were trapped in this area by the terrorist groups. So this particular brigade, which was the 25th Brigade of the Syrian army, liberated them. We were then told that a number of commanders were taken off the field. So they were removed from command of their Syrian army forces. And the forces were put under the control of one particular general that was effectively under the control of Russia. And at that point, if I can just finish. Yeah. And at that point, we started to see the surrender and the withdrawal.
Yeah. Vanessa, there seems to be this trending, since I've been born, I've been around a little bit, that the destabilization of the Middle East continues. So if you look at what's happening in Palestine, if you look at what happened in Iraq, if you look at what's happening in Libya in real time, if you look at what's going on in Syria, it seems to be this reoccurring theme that the American government in the West is hell-bent on destroying those main countries that have been really successful, at least leading their countries, without all of the propaganda that's coming out of the United States about all of this mass murder. What do you think is this a CIA operation? Is this a Western CIA MI5 operation? Or are they going to continue to keep destabilizing the Middle East? And who does it benefit? They say it benefits Iran or Iran. Who does it really benefit? Is it about the resources of these countries? Because after Gaddafi left, you saw what happened to Libya. I mean, it is a nightmare. And every country that, you know, in the Middle East that I've been following for a large part of my life, it's always in this situation where the American government has stepped in to destabilize their countries. And why is the rest of the Middle East, Dubai and all of those Emirates, why are they allowing that to happen? It's in their best interest to destroy Syria for their resources?
There's quite a few questions in
I
that one.
I know, right? Because this is a really big arc. You know, Vanessa, it is a big arc, though. And I'm listening to you. I'm like, okay, I can come up with a lot of rational narratives of why they're doing it. But can you give me some deeper understanding of why this continued fight in the Middle East, if it's not about resources and it's not about geopolitical positioning? That's bullshit. I just don't buy that anymore. But I just want to take your guidance and you can explain it to me, I guess.
Number one, of course it is CIA and MI6 and MIT, Turkey, Erdogan. The Gulf states were involved in the destabilization in Syria from 2011 onwards. Qatar bankrolled it with billions, as was admitted. I think it was by the Emir of Qatar fairly recently, in the last few years. Saudi Arabia was funding until 2017 the Wahhabi groups, the extremist groups inside Syria. Qatar, of course, with Turkey, was funding Al-Qaeda and originally the kind of Muslim Brotherhood factions, the so-called Free Syrian Army, that rapidly became empowered by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which were armed and funded under Obama's Timber Sycamore, where they were supposedly providing aid and equipment for 500 moderate rebels, which just happened to fall into the hands of ISIS. Well, I never. You know, I mean, it's just an endless stream of lies and clandestine black ops that have targeted Syria since 1946, since the CIA was actually created from what it was previously. Syria has been targeted for the last 75 years for regime change. And the main reason for that has been its alliance with the then Soviet Union and now, of course, with Russia. Because if we go back to 2009, when President Assad turned down the Qatari-Turkish pipeline, gas and oil pipeline, in favor of the Iranian-Russian-backed gas and oil pipeline, that's when basically British officials and authorities were speaking to Roland Dumas, who was the then foreign minister in France, and telling him, look, like we've given up trying to play ball with President Assad. He's not going to come onto our side. He's not going to comply with Western agenda. He's not going to relinquish the Palestinian cause. He's not going to kick Hezbollah out of Syria. He's not going to turn his back on his alliance with Iran. He's not going to turn his back on Russia. He's not going to favor Qatar. He's got his own idea about multipolarity, for heaven's sake. You know, he had then the 4 Cs or the 5 Cs project, which was going to make Syria the hub of gas and oil pipelines for going from the global south into Europe. So he was an independent. They were an independent, financially independent country. They were not reliant on the IMF. So all of this was complete anathema to the West. Plus, they threatened the security of Israel in the region. And this is not that Israel, in my opinion, as an entity, has any huge interest for the United States, other than as a bulwark for them in the Middle East, a provider of intelligence and surveillance and interference in the Middle East. And of course, you know, a Zionist project. And we know that the Zionist movement is embedded, if not completely in control of the US political system and foreign policy. And so these things can't be, the resources and the security of Israel can't really be disentangled. Robert Kennedy Jr. made that very clear. He basically said in a statement, what Israel represented, which I've just described. And then he said, and also they represent our ability to prevent the rise of the global south, the rise of Iran, the rise of China and Russia, and so on. So this is what Israel, the entity itself, represents to the West, and therefore it has to be protected at all costs. And if you look at, if you want to consider the Greater Israel project, or even if you go to the Clean Break Doctrine in 1997, which was written up actually by former kind of intelligence officials in the United States, commissioned by Netanyahu back then, this was all about creating normalization with the Gulf states, with Jordan, with Egypt. Of course, Egypt kind of was normalized back in 79 under Sadat with the Camp David Accords, which basically rendered Egypt completely toothless as regards its relations with Israel. And we've seen that develop into economic and trade. And basic Egypt for me now is very much, as like I think I've said it before, it's the Ukraine of West Asia. It's completely prostituted out to the West, to the IMF, to the Gulf states that now have huge financial stakes in the Sinai, for example. It can't move. It's totally reliant upon the Gulf states, the West, the IMF, and Israel in order to survive. So it's rendered literally powerless. Jordan, of course, is still very much a vassal state of Britain, as it always was. And we've seen it provide air defense for Israel when it's been under attack by Iran and so on. The Gulf states have, whether officially or not, but they've normalized relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords that were brought in by Jared Kushner, or they were incubated by Jared Kushner under the Trump administration. And all of this is leading to the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, which is going to go from Mumbai through the Gulf states, through Palestine. But of course, now we know Palestine is being effectively pretty much completely destroyed and annexed, particularly since Trump was elected, into El Arish and Egypt, and then to Europe. So that's in direct competition, not only with the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, but also even with Turkey. So that's another reason that Turkey now is getting involved from a kind of land grab, resource grab, neo-Ottoman Empire agenda to take control of the industrial north of Syria. So, you know, it is CIA, but CIA is only one element in this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I always start, I mean, Vanessa, always start there. I know it's a bunch of, you know, bad actors, but you just laid it out. So, but what is the immediate, for instance, you know, today is January the 2nd. What does the next 20 days look like for Syria?
That's yeah, more of the same. I mean, for example, when I was, so it was Saturday the 8th that we were receiving a lot of confusing messages in Damascus. What I was told in the morning was that there was to be like a transitional phase. So President Assad would stay for 6 months, and he would oversee the creation of a kind of a coalition government made up of all the different factions inside Syria, which seemed quite reasonable at the time. And this, we think, was brokered by Turkey, Iran, and Russia at the Doha meeting. So on Saturday morning, for example, that's what we thought was going to happen. So while some people were panicking at that point and saying I should leave and so on, when I was speaking to friends of mine, they were saying, no, like the president is staying. As far as we understand, there's going to be a ceasefire. There's a very kind of good agreement, and everything will be stable. By the afternoon, this was starting to look extremely shaky. And by the evening, it became very clear that all was not as it should be. And Homs fell very quickly, despite even the Hezbollah presence there. And once the armed groups reached Damascus, then it became apparent that the Syrian army was not going to do anything. They'd left all their posts, and that basically we were suddenly completely surrounded by armed groups. But the interesting thing is, the armed groups that actually entered Damascus didn't come from HTS and Turkey. They came from the Israel and US-backed groups in the south. So clearly what happened at some point, even if there had been an agreement between Turkey, Russia, and Iran, some people subscribed to the idea that Turkey betrayed Russia and Iran. Surprise, surprise. I'm not quite sure why either Russia or Iran would be taken aback by that. But in my opinion, what actually happened was US and Israel saw an opportunity to take control in Damascus with their armed groups from the south. And then, of course, what did we see? We saw the incursion by Israel into the southern territories. I think when I left on Sunday morning, Israel was about 15 kilometers away from where I was living in western Damascus. So they moved very fast. Sorry, I've kind of lost track of the question.
Well, you've been under an enormous amount of stress. What is Russia's role going to be in the region now? I mean, since they played a heavy role with Syria and Bashar. So what are they going to do to reinvent themselves in the region, or are they just going to disappear?
Yeah, Russia's an interesting point. Look, for me, when you look at the resistance axis, Russia isn't ideologically involved in it. I'm not even entirely convinced that Russia has any kind of ideological resistance. It has its national security. It has a very pragmatic approach to geopolitics. And I think for Russia, there is a strong potential that it has been in negotiations with Trump after his election over Ukraine, with the potential that Syria was sacrificed in order for a deal to be made that benefited Russia in Ukraine. That remains to be seen, but some of the language that is coming out now and reading between the lines of Lavrov and Putin when they're talking about, yes, they're prepared to negotiate with Trump, etc., etc. At the same time, I also think that from a Russian perspective, Syria had become untenable for the future. It was costing them, I think someone told me, around 4 million a day to keep their military base running there. Assad was for them too intransigent. It had taken him too long to come forward with a new constitution. He had refused multiple times to negotiate, or at least come to the negotiation table with Erdogan. In some ways, quite rightly, but he wasn't in a strong enough position. I mean, he was under incredibly tough sanctions. Syrian resources had been occupied by the United States for pretty much all of the 14 years. Air defense had been strategically destroyed by the terrorist groups from the moment that they invaded Syria. I do see arguments that Russia and China should have been more proactive in actually kind of keeping Syria afloat to a large degree, because Syria is the buffer for Iran, but also for Russia and China to a large degree, because there's 10,000 plus Uyghur terrorists inside Syria. There's probably similar numbers of Chechen terrorists inside Syria. So I think it remains to be seen, but what we do see now is that Russia is very much reliant upon Turkey. Why? Because one, Turkey will be the guarantor for the existing Russian military base and naval base at Haimamin, if it still has full control over the various gangs that are now marauding throughout Syria, which of course include the Chechen gangs that are definitely against Russian presence. We've seen Ukraine officials that were training the armed groups in Idlib, at least for the last 12 months, and providing drone technology, providing training and equipment and weapons in return for Jolani sending terrorists to Ukraine to fight against Russia. We've seen a visit by the Ukrainian, I think it was the foreign minister, where they're actually saying, well, we can guarantee your security, but you have to kick Russia out, basically. Yeah. So the existing transitional government, which, by the way, has now said there won't be elections for 4 years and we can't provide a new constitution for 3 years. So they're already backtracking on their official mandate from their handlers in the West. Russia is moving to some degree into Libya. But the problem in Libya, in my opinion, they're also then beholden to Turkey, because Turkey occupies much of the east. The Russian base is very much in central Libya, and Turkey has control of many of the naval ports on the Libyan coast. But Russia needs a base in the region in order to continue its activities in Africa, for example. Turkey is now brokering deals for them, I think, in I might be wrong on this, I think in Somalia and Ethiopia. So, yeah, for me, it kind of remains to be seen. For HTS, I think they'll be put under pressure to not continue the deal with Russia in Syria. Yeah, that's going to be negotiated over the next few weeks. But personally, I don't see them staying inside Syria.
Wow. Well, things are not looking well for Russia at this present moment. That's very interesting. But as far as Syria is concerned, let me ask you another question, because there's something that you said when you talked about Egypt, and when you talked about not Turkey but Egypt, and you talk about Jordan. You're saying basically they're now just proxies of the American government as we speak, or proxies that are now friendly towards Israel, but actually acting as a proxy for the American government because they're being financed by the American government to further help and assist to destabilize the Middle East. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say the greater influence in Jordan, although NATO were talking last year of establishing a NATO base in Jordan. I would say they're more heavily under the influence of British intelligence, so under the influence of MI6. But that, of course, also means, like now, you have Israel basically threatening Jordan with regime change or destabilization. This has been put out there as a sort of public statement by Israel as a warning to King Abdullah that there is potential for destabilizing Jordan if Jordan doesn't accept the terms that Israel is likely to put forward, which of course will be the resettlement of the refugees from Gaza to finally ethnically cleanse Gaza and get rid of the remaining Palestinians from inside Gaza and also from the West Bank, because since Trump's election, you've heard the rhetoric from the Zionist regime that they can now fully annex the West Bank. So the ethnic cleansing project involves Jordan taking responsibility for the refugees. Otherwise, it faces either internal destabilization, because there are extremist elements very much tied to HTS in Syria already existing, already operating inside Jordan, and already operating inside northern Lebanon, and already operating inside Egypt. So if you look at who's behind HTS, really, that's the Muslim Brotherhood, as I call it, crescent, because we always talk about the Iranian, the Shia crescent. This is the Muslim Brotherhood arc, which is Turkey, Qatar, perceiving Syria being converted into what is effectively a dominant Sunni caliphate with sections for ethnic minorities carved out of that. But that same movement can be triggered, as it is being triggered right now in northern Lebanon, for example.
Okay, wow. Well, thank you, Vanessa. That's very enlightening. I'm going to actually read your Substack today, by the way. I'm gonna read it.
Thank you.
I should have read it last night, but I'm going to definitely read it today.
So brilliant to have you here, Vanessa. Thank you so much. And I want to continue with the subject in the same way. We had the last time Dr. Reza John Vedadi on the show, and he said that that Assad was very tired. So as you said, he was under very big pressure with the sanctions. He was exhausted by, let's say, by the Americans who take all the oils from him, and the Russians and the Chinese, they invited him to establish a complete new, let's say, connection and to regrow his state. And Dr. Reza John Vedadi said that his father, Assad's father, told him never leave Iran. But because of the pressure, he decided to work with the Arabic League, and this was maybe the mistake. Do you think the same?
I have a slight problem with this idea. I'm not saying that President Assad didn't, to some degree, think that he could receive some help for the country from Saudi Arabia, UAE. And I have to actually say that UAE is one of the countries that so far I don't think has recognized the HTS government inside Syria. But if we go back to how many weeks was it before the Aleppo operation began at the Arab League summit, President Assad's speech was a total shaming of the Gulf states in their inability to prevent the genocide. So, you know, he didn't, even if he was perhaps overstretched in trying to save the country. I mean, what is extraordinary now, you know, they're talking about lifting sanctions. They're not. They're actually pretending that they're going to keep the Caesar sanctions on until 2029. But I think this is just a complete cosmetic BS, because of course they're going to lift the sanctions, because now they consider Syria to be under their control. They can do what they want with it. They can take the resources, as Israel is doing in the south, and so on. So we are going to see, we've seen the normalization of HTS. We've seen the lifting of the bounty, the 10 million bounty on Jolani's head. You know, soon we're going to be told they were never terrorists. They were always just freedom fighters and rebels and so on. Like, history is being completely rewritten right now, because there's no journalists, there's no people on the ground inside Syria who are not either too afraid to say what is really going on, or are there, of course, paid by the West to come in and rewrite the narratives and rewrite history, as they always do. So I think yes, Assad was kind of trying to do his utmost to resolve the problems that he had, which was the occupation of resources. Iran was supplying enough oil to kind of keep electricity running at the minimum. Now, of course, what's happening, Qatar is sending ships to the Eastern Mediterranean to provide electricity. Turkey is talking about providing electricity. Like, everyone suddenly is able to come to the help of Syria. But where were they? You know, I mean, we know where they were. They were told not to, but this is the point. Now suddenly Syria's okay. You know, it could have been okay from a humanitarian perspective, from the perspective of the Syrian people.
Yeah.
But of course it wasn't, because that's not what the West does. So I semi agree with it, but I still think that he was he didn't abandon his principles regarding the resistance in relation to the Gulf states. If you go on his speech at the Arab League summit a few weeks before the attacks began.
Yeah, we were only, the question is why he did refuse to work with China, Iran, and Russia. Why did he leave this track? This is something what we don't understand.
When did he refuse to work with China?
No,
Iran
the
and
situation is that China, as I understood Dr. John Vedadi correctly, Assad was invited by China for a long-term relationship, and if they would have, or if they had supported him, if China and Russia and Iran had supported him economically in order to increase the state again, in order to increase the economy, in that moment, I suppose they would have also brought military securities. This was my opinion. And but at the end there were no such securities, so that Turkey and Israel could invade in this country.
I think it's a little bit more complex than that. For example, Russia was given exclusive exploration rights on the gas off the coast of Syria. And for whatever reason, maybe Russia decided it wasn't the right time. Maybe they didn't want a glut of gas because they were struggling to export into Europe. And again, that would involve Turkey, but they never exploited it. Now, had Russia exploited that gas, presumably it would have also served Syria itself. Right? So that's one thing. Two, again, I don't perceive China as getting involved militarily in any of the countries where it's expanding its soft power base. Because that's not really how China operates. Russia tends to operate more from a military perspective. I don't know if Drago agrees with me, but I don't think it's really good at soft power. It hasn't really got into that yet. It relies very much on military support through previously, particularly in Africa, through the Wagner Group, for example. And the Wagner Group were operating heavily in Syria until the Prigozhin affair, and then they were withdrawn, which did actually leave Syria quite vulnerable in various areas where previously the Wagner Group had been established there. And what people do need to understand is when Iran and Russia are talking about the fact that they had offered to modernize the Syrian army, they were already doing that, because Iran and Russia were working with specific divisions of the Syrian army already inside Syria. And those specific divisions were receiving the help and the weapons and the training and the arms and so on and so forth. So to some degree, it was already ongoing. I personally, I think everyone is trying to kind of get out of being blamed for what happened. That's my personal opinion. Nobody really wants to put their hands up and say, yeah, actually, you know, we decided that Syria is too much for a handful and we don't really want to deal with it anymore. We'll relinquish that for whatever other interests we have. For Iran, I think genuinely they already had forces there. And this was another strange thing in Putin's address, is that he claimed that Russia had evacuated 4,000 Iranian forces from Syria back to Tehran. This is actually nonsense. Russia withdrew from the airport in Latakia. They actually withdrew from it when the terrorist armed forces were gathering in this particular area. And it was the Iranian forces that retook it and made it safe for the flights to be able to leave. And Iran evacuated all of its forces from the coastal region back to Tehran. Russia was involved in the evacuation of some Iranian civilians from the Sayda Zainab area in eastern Damascus, and some other nationalities, I think, also were taken out by Russia from this area to the coast to Haimamim, and then back they were repatriated. So there's still kind of a lot of loose ends for me, and there's a lot of on the ground information that leads me to think Russia had full knowledge of what was going on. I mean, they had provided the surveillance of the Ukrainian special forces, for example, coming into Idlib. Russia was largely responsible for the ceasefire in Idlib, which gave the terrorist groups 4 or 5 years to prepare. And while they were able to surveil the area, and they knew that there were NATO special forces, they knew that they were planning false flag chemical attacks, they knew what the white helmets were up to, and yet nothing really happened. It was allowed to continue. And then finally, in the last year, with Ukraine coming in and actually training, I mean, we have videos of fairly professional-looking training camps and recruitment centers and drone technology development areas and so on, and manufacturing sites. And I also have it on very good authority that even after Aleppo fell, and we all assumed that they were withdrawing to pull the terrorists into a kind of trap between northern Hama and Aleppo, the numbers of dead terrorists that were being put out by the Russian military centers were largely exaggerated, and that Russia actually was not carrying out the bombing campaign that it was talking about. It was already starting to withdraw, and the Syrian Arab Army forces were getting absolutely battered by the drone warfare at that point. There was nothing that they could do because they didn't in that area have good air defense. So, you know, I think if we are going to be pragmatic about this, I think Syria became too much of a burden for many of the allies, and that where there wasn't the resistance ideology, that entire resistance axis ideology, like with Iran, I think certain allies took a decision that, okay, this is it. We can't keep this country afloat with all of the sanctions, with the resources, and so on. And we are where we are now.
Yeah. I see. It's very sad, and I saw today that you had posted a report about the change in the schools and the change in the language, so that the Sharia law will come, let's say, become the main force in this country, and it's so insane. For example, in Germany, no Syrians are allowed to ask for asylum anymore, because now it's free. Yeah. The funny thing is we got 10 years ago, or we got over the last 10 years, we got all the enemies of Assad who came to us. Yeah. And who don't respect our Christmas markets. They destroyed our beautiful Sylvester, more or less. Mm-hmm. And now the people who are suffering so much in Syria, who are Christians, who are, let's say, people who have our culture, they are not allowed to come to Germany. This is very insane. And at the same time, our Minister for Development, for country development, she is willing to give 60 million euros to Syria, by the UN, by UNICEF, and to NGOs, and in order to support women and children. Yeah, this is.
Well, I think also, I think it's Austria that started the idea of actually paying Syrian refugees 1,000 each to go back to Syria, which I would assume would only be the extremist elements that fled the liberation campaign by the Syrian military and by the Syrian government for the last 14 years, right? While, as you say, they're closing their borders to the genuinely persecuted minorities, like, for example, Christians, that we know now are being persecuted pretty much across all denominations inside Syria, the Alawites, the Shia anyone, like basically anyone, can be persecuted right now under the basis that they are regime remnants. That's the term that is being used to justify extrajudicial executions, hangings, torture, beatings, disappearances, shootings. I mean, and it's becoming more and more extreme on a daily basis right now. And yet those people are denied any kind of asylum in European countries. While, as you said, they opened the floodgates, not entirely to extremist factions. Of course, there were genuine refugees in amongst them, but the large majority, in my opinion, were from the extremist ranks that are now, as I said, sort of rampaging throughout Syria. And yeah, they've changed. They're slightly backtracking on it now. They're saying that they're going to put it to a kind of a committee to decide on it. But what they've done is, for example, they've removed all reference to the homeland, anything that was secular. So instead of it being defending the homeland, now, of course, it's defending the word of God. So everything now will be a religious ruling. They're removing the history from Syria, like Queen Zenobia. You know, all of the historical figures, they're claiming that she was made up. I mean, Palmyra was Queen Zenobia, of course, which was destroyed twice by ISIS.
Yes.
And Khaled al-Assad, the archaeologist who was murdered in Palmyra. So yeah, it's, as I said, Syria is going through, in my opinion, one of its darkest ages right now. And it is very sad.
Yeah, and now I also depend on Drago. In my opinion, the reason why the Arabic League doesn't really support Assad is also with respect to the military equipment, as the Arabic League is supported by the United States. They have bought all the military stuff from the Americans. They rely on... Oh, sorry. Hello?
Right.
We hear you, Matt Hartmut.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're just frozen.
Done. Okay.
You can continue, Hartmut, even if your camera is frozen.
My computer
Thank
works
you.
weird here. Okay. The situation is that the military equipment, which is bought by the Arabic League, is American equipment, and the American equipment needs also a lot of maintenance. And in the moment when the Americans would stop the maintenance of this military equipment, they would become useless in a very short time, so that the Arabic League would not be able to defend themselves against an enemy. And this is maybe the possibility also for Israel to expand their borders and get their big country like they want to have it. But Drago can give me a little bit of support in this field if he wants to.
Yeah, I mean that's true 100%, and I know for a fact from direct sources from Greece, for instance, they were operating Saudi Patriot air defense systems, and we know that Egypt essentially depends entirely on U.S. military aid, so-called aid. But the interesting thing is when they get the F-16s and the Abrams tanks and whatever, they are heavily downgraded, and they are no match for the Israelis. So, for instance, you have the Israeli F-16I, which is like 20 years ahead of Egyptian F-16s. I mean, it's the same type of a jet, but you take away the systems and subsystems which are advanced, and you put the basic ones, and suddenly you have the jet that looks the same on the outside, but it's fairly different. So, yeah, in that regard, Syria was the only country in the Arab world besides Algeria that was militarily independent. And I think the big issue, I mean, of course, I support the people who are now the resistance in Syria, where the former Syrian Arab army. But the pessimistic thing about it is that now the air defense systems are gone. The Israelis launched 500 attacks on these systems, and they've been destroyed. And it took them like almost like a week to destroy these things.
Yeah.
And the point is, people don't even understand how important these systems were. They were being built for decades, and billions of dollars were invested. And this was one of the cornerstones of Syrian sovereignty, because if you have the control over the skies, and NATO and West, it functions on in terms of air superiority. And if you deny that, then you can remain independent to a certain degree, at least. Now that's not going to be possible anymore, because you don't have air defenses, and Israelis and whoever in the U.S. will be able, even if we get the resistance to take back the country tomorrow, it's going to be very difficult to defend the country when you don't have the tools to defend it. They would just be sending bombers to bomb whatever they want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, they've not only destroyed the air defense, they've destroyed Syria's capability to build weapons. I mean, they've destroyed the underground development, science and research centers. I mean, on the Saturday night when I was in Damascus, that was when they started. So as HTS and the groups from the south were entering Damascus, they started bombing with the bunker buster bombs, because I remember calling my friend and saying, like, why is the house shaking? Because they were bombing that near where I live. There were two big air defense bases that they were always bombing anyway. But at this point, because there was no air defense teams left, they could come in with the heavy duty bombs like they did in Lebanon with the bunker busters and bomb everything. And so they didn't only bomb air defense, they were bombing airplanes, helicopters, air bases, development centers. So they've destroyed, the Navy, everything, even kind of oil fields and so on. They were bombing everything. So Syria is back in the dark ages as regards any kind of military development. And when you're talking about Egypt, of course, that's what they've done in Lebanon. Because what does Lebanon have? The Lebanese army has 2 Cessna planes that were slightly upgraded, I think, to carry Hellfire missiles. But I mean, compare that to the billions that have gone into Israel. Lebanon has no air defense. So if the Lebanese army is to defend itself against Israel, it's incapable of doing it, because the US sponsors the Lebanese army, but it's kept it at a level where it can't defend Lebanon at all. And that's why Hezbollah is 100% necessary in Lebanon, because the army can't cope with what Israel is doing right now during the ceasefire in the south, for example. And it can't extend itself to deal with the whole border with Syria, which is now awash with kind of ISIS, HTS, because ISIS now are on the border close to Homs. It's not HTS, this is ISIS. And coming back to the whole ISIS issue, of course, now in the last 2 days, we've seen that, guess what? ISIS are being released from the holding camps in the northeast. We know that upwards of 11,000 to 15,000 ISIS are now inside Iraq, ready to carry out operations against the resistance factions there, particularly Hashd al-Shabi or the PMU, that are actually part of the Iraqi military. So, you know, this entire operation is looking to expand. And I think what you're probably going to see also, there's already rumblings of unrest inside Egypt. So potentially Egypt also is going to be plunged into instability. Because ultimately what Israel wants is none of its neighbors having the capability to be a threat, not only now, but in the future. So for me, there's potential for every single element of the resistance axis, of course, ending in Iran, with them having the agenda of trying to pulverize them to the extent that they have Syria. And what it also means is that Israel now can launch attacks from inside Syria against Iraq and against Iran, which of course it couldn't before.
The interesting thing is, in that regard, ISIS is almost like the vanguard of all this. And And we see that in the fact that ISIS was the most active in Egypt in Sinai. So why
Yeah.
Sinai? I mean, it could have been any other place, right? It could have been the Nubia, it could have been the areas close to the Libyan border, but it's always Sinai. And they're never attacking the Israelis, they're always attacking the Egyptian military. So, I mean, what's the point? Like, you're Muslims, but you're
I know, but
Muslims.
look at the statements coming from Jolani and from HTS. I mean, who was it? The governor of Damascus that was basically saying, no, we don't want any war with Israel now. We want to normalize relations. And this is what they were offering from the very beginning. Even before they entered Aleppo, they were talking about normalization with Israel. They would offer an Israeli embassy in Damascus and in Lebanon. And if you look at what Jolani said today, like basically he's saying that they attacked Damascus to prevent the escalation by Iran, Iraq, and Syria against Israel. So they were effectively launched by Israel under threat from the resistance axis. He couldn't have said it more clearly. And then he also goes on to say that they launched the attack to protect. I mean, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but this is genuinely what he meant to say. To protect the US occupation unlawful bases in the region and to long-term protect the interests of the Gulf states. What does this mean? This means the normalization with Israel and you know, the partnership and collaboration with the West, right? So he was absolutely clear today. I don't know who's giving him his script, but they're not doing a very good job at hiding what they were being used for, which is as a kind of a, like you said, a vanguard of protection for Israel, and they've done the best job. Look at, I mean, in 2 weeks, Syria is reduced to a landmass with no borders, no military, no defense, and no resources.
No, essentially, it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately.
No, as a sovereign state, no.
Yeah, as a
right.
sovereign state. I mean, I actually wrote an article about it, and which says the one of the last sovereign states in the region have been destroyed. And I mean, it's you know, I was shocked by everything that was going on. I thought that, you know, if Syria survived 2012 and 2013 and 2014, it can survive anything. But this was just incredible. The interesting thing is now the Israelis are having this harsh rhetoric towards Egypt, and then it got me thinking, you know, from the river to the river, from the Nile to the Euphrates River, the talk about the Greater Israel Project. You know, to me, it really seems insane because, I mean, if you look at the map, you think, oh, it's impossible because, I mean, you have hundreds of millions of people who live in those areas, and none of them want to be part of any sort of Greater Israel. But if we look at the map in Syria, it's almost as if that section of the Greater Israel Project is done because they control everything to the Euphrates River. I mean, the guys who don't want to have, you know, enemies, who don't want to be enemies with Israel. So their allies now control all of that area, minus, of course, the Kurdish Kurdish held areas in the northeast, which are probably going to be taken by Turkey if the Turks want it, because, I mean, there's no way that the U.S. is going to get into a confrontation with Turkey, with a NATO member that has nuclear weapons on its territory, for the sake of the Kurds. I mean, the Kurds played their role. They destabilized Syria at some point, and then they took all these areas where their oil is. And of course, I don't think they need. We lost Vanessa.
Do continue, Drago.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that, I mean, it seems that the Israelis have already, you know, accomplished their goal of creating one section of the Greater Israel. I mean, it's not called Greater Israel. It doesn't belong to Israel directly, but I mean, if you get your ally to control or a vassal to control a certain area, it's almost as if you're controlling it too. And now they're talking about Egypt, and of course, the Nile is in Egypt, so it seems to me.
And Drago, I want to emphasize what you said, or what you confirmed, that the that the military equipment is completely useless without maintenance from the Americans. And if Israel, we have seen in the speech of Netanyahu who is in control of USA. Yeah, and if they want to, and if they don't give the maintenance, I suppose Israel would win the war with all the countries around them.
Oh yeah, I mean, Egypt couldn't last a day without U.S. Military aid, as it's called, because the U.S. is giving billions of dollars to Egypt, and it's been giving them this money for decades. I think since the mid 1980s, something like that, 1985 or 86. And of course, this includes like hundreds, if not over 1,000 M1 Abrams tanks and dozens or if not hundreds of these F-16 jets. So without the U.S. support, these things would just fail. They wouldn't be functioning, because the issue with the U.S. and how the U.S. builds weapons, it's made by private companies whose main goal is what? It's profit, right? The military-industrial complex doesn't care about efficiency that much, as much as it cares about profits. So you have the Lockheed Martin or the Raytheon. Why would they want to sell something to you? Well, they want to sell it to you for profit. So they don't really care if the missile or a rocket or a tank or a jet is efficient enough. They just care about the how much money they're going to make. So in that regard, I don't see how a country like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, or even if they wanted to, but how they could fight Israel. Like, first of all, they don't have the manpower. And when I say manpower, I mean trained manpower. What Saudi Arabia does, usually it sinks billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars into all sorts of U.S. weapon systems, but it cannot operate them. And even after they send officers to be trained, they're not very well trained. They never get enough training, or they can't figure it out. I don't know what the reason is. But they nearly always need foreign troops to be stationed there to help them to make these things work. So in that regard, I mean, most Arab countries from Libya to UAE would simply collapse without U.S. control over their militaries. And of course, this is their fault. I mean, if the Russians and the Iranians could train the Syrians to operate their own military, any other country would be able to do that. But of course, it's not in the interest of the U.S. and its allies in the region for any Arab country to have an independent military or foreign policy or whatever.
I just want to emphasize, for example, I read today an article, the 50-year-old transport helicopter Sikorsky CH-53. If you make one flight, it needs 24 hours maintenance. Yeah. So this says everything about American
well, I mean, worse things. If you look at the American F-22, for every flight of for every hour of flight, you need about 60 hours of maintenance. So that means like your jet can fly maybe 3 times a week. And if you look at the Russian Su-35, it has like 7 sorties per day. So the difference in operational capabilities is absolutely insane. Like, even if it's the best jet in the world, like, you're gonna have it fly once, and then you have to get it back to the base, and whoever wants to attack you just needs to hit the base, and that's it. Your jet is gone. I mean, you can't even repair it. You can't refuel. You can't do anything. And this is why Syria, despite the fact that it's outnumbered and simply outmatched by all the other countries around it, it was able to have a sort of deterrence, because they had the Scud missiles, they had Tochka-U missiles. Like, if the Turks wanted to attack Syria in the 1980s, Syria just had to hit their bases with missiles, and those bases would become non-operational. They wouldn't be able to bomb. On the other hand, the issue was much bigger in the 2000s, when the Soviet Union was not around anymore and couldn't support Syria as it did during the 80s, and many of the Syrian deterrent systems went down in quality and in quantity. And I think what Vanessa mentioned about the peace process in Idlib in 2019, I also thought that it was a mistake, you know, for them to stop, because they had the upper hand. They could have just swept through the area and destroyed the remnants of this terrorist army. But from what I've heard from the Russians, at the time, the Turks were threatening with a direct invasion. So the Turks were telling the Russians and the Iranians that if they don't stop and if they try to retake all of Idlib, then the Turkish military would get directly involved and send 100,000 soldiers to the area. And then, of course, the Syrians wouldn't be able to withstand such an attack. It would be far worse than any terrorists. So that was the reason why the Russians decided to, you know, make sort of this disadvantageous peace agreement. That, I mean, it really wasn't necessary from a military standpoint, but I guess the geopolitics, when it gets into it, it's an issue, because if the Turks were to get involved, then it would be a direct confrontation between Iran and Syria and Russia on one hand, and NATO and Turkey on the other, and that would have been a much bigger problem for Syria and its allies.
Well, Vanessa, you said something. One of the things I see in the caption, I was just thinking about everything everybody was talking about. You said Syria, fallen civilization that will rise again. I think Grace put that up there as a header. How can Syria rebound from this in the next 20 years? That's really interesting, because the Middle East looks like a, you know, I hate to say this, a shit show right now, and so many moving parts. But how could Syria rise again? What could be the one thing that it can do to, you know, stop the destabilization, or look at how they can become a nation again of people that are thriving in that region and not caught up in the geopolitics that continue to occur?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of $1 million question. And you know, many of the Syrians that I'm talking to are still in shock, you know, and that's something that they've got to process themselves. I mean, it's very hard to describe. The depth of shock. This was a seismic event within the resistance, and you know, this is after the resistance lost how many Hezbollah leaders, including the General Secretary, Secretary General, Said Nasrallah, after Hamas lost most of its core resistance command. It's, you know, and Iranian IRGC advisors and commanders who were targeted inside Syria itself. So there had been huge losses for the resistance, but I don't think anyone actually, if you had told me like 1 week before this all kicked off that this was what was going to be the end result, I'd have just laughed, you know, because everyone knew to some degree there was an attack coming, but nobody expected it to unfold as it did. And the level of confusion and trauma and shock and dismay that people have still got to work through, and that's on top of the kind of the persecution campaigns and the killings and the criminality now that is running riot throughout all of Syria, plus the hostile nations that are now fighting over what remains of Syrian territory. So, you know, you have the US and Israel, you have Turkey, you have ISIS, you have the Kurds that are backed by the US and Israel, you have HTS, and then you have all the factions within HTS that are not cohesive. So at what point do they become like the mafia warlords that we saw in the occupied territories before 2024, or let's say up until 2020 when the final liberation was achieved by the Syrian army and its allies. But I think what you are going to see initially is a resistance on a local level, because as Drager pointed out, you know, that there's no longer a Syrian military capability. So the resistance is going to be, as you're seeing, from the coastal regions, from some Christian factions. I think you're going to start to see that more and more. You're seeing it with the Druze, although I have some issues anyway with the Druze and their alliance with Israel to a large degree for their separatist movement. But that's only a minority within the Druze community. So now you're seeing the Druze finally, like one faction is recovering its senses and saying, no, we're not surrendering our arms. We refuse. And HTS has tried to enter Sweden and they've been pushed back. So I think this is what you're going to start seeing, is a recovery from the elements that are not necessarily, as I said, pro-Assad or pro-government or anything like that, but they're pro a secular Syria. They're against being ruled by a Takfiri regime that is going to take Syria back to the Dark Ages, which is what the CIA and the MI6 wanted with every country that represented any kind of resistance against their foreign policy and against Israeli security in the region. Right. So I think that's number one. I think talking with people in the last few days, what I'm seeing is a desire. Well, okay, like if militarily we're now weaker, we're not potentially able to fight back right now, but why can't we produce a political resistance? What can the world say against that? If we can unite under a political banner and get it recognized as being a Syrian political party that breaks away from the old paradigm, but represents the secular pluralist Syria again, perhaps under this political umbrella, we can unite all of the factions that are against being ruled by CIA Takfiri project. So I think, I guess what I'm trying to say, Syria has existed for 10,000 years. It's faced multiple imperialist projects throughout its existence. It's one of the oldest civilizations in the world today. And that doesn't go away easily. So I think, we have to put it into the context of history. And when you look at it like that, Syria is not going to just go down with a whimper and be forgotten and its history be wiped out. That's just simply not going to happen.
Where's Bashir right now? Where is he at now? Is he in Russia?
Presumably, yeah, he's in Russia. Although, I mean, nobody's seen him since he left. There was a story today but it was I think it was in something ridiculous like The Sun, that he had an attempt on his life through poisoning, but I don't know. I mean, Putin is talking about meeting with him soon. But as a couple of people also said to me today, unfortunately, we have to assume he's yesterday's man, and now Syria has to move forward with a new vision and a new way of resisting the attempts to turn it into not even another Libya. It would be worse than another Libya, to be honest.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
And in follow-up, sorry, Herbert, and in follow-up with what you just said, Vanessa, what Drago described, I think it was also you, Drago, that mentioned in the other podcast you've had that now the real civil war starts in Syria as compared to what people
makes sense. Yeah.
I always hated the name Syrian civil war because I never considered it a civil war.
Exactly.
Just like they were saying in Yugoslavia, there were civil wars. No, it was an invasion. You can call it whatever you want, but the point is you have outside powers who are funding and arming various groups. I mean, even just look at the map. Where was this so-called democratic rebellion starting? Well, in the north, in border areas with Turkey, in border areas with Israel and Jordan, and in border areas with Iraq, where the ISIS was. So, I mean, it's a civil war as much as the German invasion of Poland was a civil war. It's ridiculous, and of course now it's going to be a civil war. But before that, it was an invasion. Unfortunately, it was a successful invasion. I don't know. I mean, I really hope that not just the minorities, but also secular Sunnis will all come together and just push back, because first of all, these psychos and these maniacs and I don't even know how to call them. I don't consider them human beings. They're savages, absolute savages, and some of them, well, they will have to go back, and then at least half of the manpower of the current government or I mean, whatever it's called. I don't even know how to call them. It's gonna be gone, and then it's going to be even more difficult for them to sustain whatever control they think they have. So I think this is going to be a chance for the resistance to take back the country. But the real issue is, how is the country going to be held together if the Turks are in the north, and you have the Israelis and the others in the south. And I don't think the Arab League is going to change its policy. I don't see that happening anytime soon. And because they're in the U.S. and Israeli pockets, and there's just no way for them. I mean, there are no besides Algeria, there are no sovereign Arab nations. I don't see a single one that can say, "Oh, we are sovereign," or we're making sovereign decisions besides Algeria, and Algeria is just too far from there.
And Yemen.
Yeah, of course, Yemen, but Yemen has its own fight. Yemen has to liberate itself first. And I'm impressed by what the Houthis are doing. I mean, Ansar Allah has, but just using the name Houthis for the people to understand who they really are. And I mean, their struggle is something that should be inspiring everywhere around the world, because these people have, for those who don't know, you should check out how these people look. I mean, they're bare skin and bones. Like, they haven't been eating normal for a decade or so, even longer. And but they still continue to fight, despite the fact they have no food, no medicine, that they are being bombed on top of all of that. But they're still pushing back. And despite the fact that this is happening to them, they're also striking at Israel. They're striking at NATO shipping in the Red Sea. I mean, they have their own fight. They could be the first to say, "Oh, this is not our fight." They could say, "We have our own problems. We need to liberate ourselves first." But they still want to help. So in that regard, they have, pardon the expression, they have far more balls than any of the Arab countries in the region, or Muslim countries even. So they should. I mean, they should inspire these countries in the region. But it seems to me that this has like the opposite effect. They're being attacked by the Arab League instead of being helped by the Arab League. So I don't know. The Arabs and Muslims in the region, they need to find sovereignty first if they want to hope to have any sort of future in that area.
I have one question. The HTS and all these allies who now invaded Syria, they all worked with mercenaries. So the question is, how huge is the support of the people in Syria? Are there people who support this kind of government, or what is the percentage?
Yeah, I mean, there are. That's what I was talking about when I say the sanctions are designed to make a country crumble from within. And Syria had been under sanctions actually since, I think, around 1979, but incremental since then. And of course, under Trump administration, they brought in the Caesar sanctions, which basically penalized any country that came to the assistance of Syria. On top of that, resources were occupied. The country was reliant upon Iran providing just enough fuel to keep, as I said, the bare minimum of electricity in all areas of Syria. Deliberately, the terrorists had destroyed much of the infrastructure, so the power stations, the electrical stations, water stations, dams, and so on. So the entire infrastructure had also been damaged or destroyed deliberately by the terrorist groups from 2011 onwards, and also the air defense bases and so on that were attacked in the very first weeks of the invasion by the various Takfiri groups from Turkey, as you mentioned, Drago, from Jordan and so on, and from Iraq, and of course originally from Libya. And so people were really tired. And I mean, you know, people were tired of struggling. They were tired with inflation. They were tired of corruption. But my argument is corruption existed before 2011. Corruption exists in every single country in the world. But when people have everything they need, when they have electricity, when they have jobs, when they have a car, they have a house, they have a future, they have education, free education, they have free healthcare, they don't really care what the ruling elite are up to because they're fine. When you put people into a war situation, so 14 years of war and economic sanctions and no resources and so on, the corruption becomes a big, 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 big issue, right? And this is all deliberate to turn the people against the state. We saw the elections in 2021 when millions of Syrians came out on the streets in celebration of Assad winning the elections again. And you can't tell me that was all orchestrated, because I actually went onto the streets of Damascus. I was shocked by the number of people that came out to party and to have a celebration and so on, even back then. But then you had another 3 years of absolute draconian war of attrition against the Syrian people, and they're tired. The army is tired. I mean, people are making this big thing of each terrorist is being paid $1,000 a month, and the Syrian Arab Army soldier is still receiving maybe $15, 15, not 50, $15. But they were fighting for 14 years with this salary. It hasn't changed. These conditions haven't changed, but they're tired. And they'd lost hope, and they had been plunged into despair, which is very difficult for any government to manage, and mistakes were made. So when the idea that something might change for the better, it's human nature to think, yeah, great, we'll support this because it's got to be better than what we had before. But within 48 hours, even friends of mine who were like, well, let's see, like maybe, you know, maybe they won't do a bad job. And so like they were killing themselves. Within 48 hours, they were saying to me, okay, I was stupid. Like, I really shouldn't have believed in this. I should have remembered what we fought for the last 14 years. But this is kind of a normal process for these people to go through. And of course, there are elements. I mean, they released how many prisoners from all of the prisons in the areas where they were. Now, you can't tell me there are not criminals in Syria that were put in prison as they're put in prison in every other country. So there were rapists, and there were killers, and there were former real extremist monsters that were put into particularly Sadnaya prison. I mean, Sadnaya prison is like Groundhog Day that we're seeing all this propaganda again, because we saw it all back in 2016, 2017, and it was all debunked back then. I mean, this idea of 150,000 prisoners, the former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, who visited Sadnaya, he said it's ridiculous. It can hold maximum 3,000. 150,000, where are they going to put all these people? And most of the prisoners in there were the extremists that had attacked, for example, the Sadnaya monastery, which is very close to Sadnaya prison. So they've effectively released a bunch of criminals, some political prisoners, but that's a tiny percentage. And most of those are Muslim Brotherhood leaders and instruments of the West to destabilize Syria, who were in prison for their views, quite rightly. These criminal elements have been released back into society. And so, of course, they're looting and they're stealing and they're murdering and they're carrying out sectarian killings. So is there support? Yes, there's support from within the Muslim Brotherhood factions inside Syria, which is a fairly big percentage, as it is in Egypt, as it is in Jordan, as it is throughout the Middle East, and particularly in Turkey. If you remember in 2016, the failed coup and the brutality carried out by the Muslim Brotherhood against the protesters, which was horrifying after the coup, after Erdogan had been tipped off by Russia, actually, that the coup was going to happen. But if you saw the Muslim Brotherhood atrocities committed against protesters, unarmed protesters at that time, that gives you an indication of the kind of elements that are now on the streets inside Syria. So is there support? They're going to show you that there is millions on the streets in support, but they're not going to show you the millions that are staying in their homes because they're too scared to go outside, because the guns have been picked up from the police stations by 10, 12-year-old kids who are just firing at anything, and that it's a completely lawless society, and HTS doesn't have the manpower to be able to consolidate power. It can't control all of this. Its messaging is good because it's being sort of rebranded by the MI6 and CIA. It's being told what to say, but it doesn't have the manpower to actually control what is going on. And you've got, what have they done? They've promoted foreign Takfiri agents to the military. So now you've got Jordanians, you've got Turks, you've got Uzbeks, you've got Afghanis, you've got all nationalities, Uyghurs, in the so-called Syrian military, the rebranded Syrian military, and in positions of power inside Syria that believe that this is their caliphate, and anyone that doesn't comply with the rules of the caliphate can be killed or ethnically cleansed.
Yeah, there's actually a part where I posted a video of that where I think it's the NBC anchor who was reporter who was there, and he was like telling the guys, "Oh, like remove your ISIS patch, you know, it's not good for the TV." It's ridiculous.
What's his name? James Longman.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's his name. I forgot his name. Like, it's ridiculous. It's essentially like ISIS took over the country. It's not. It's not even like HTS. It's just a rebrand. It's ISIS. Pretty much, it's ISIS taking over the country, and now they have their little caliphate, and anyone and everyone who stands in the way will be killed. And I mean, I've seen horrifying videos. I've seen like they're kidnapping women and kids, and they're beheading people. And I mean, beatings are nothing. Like, if you get beatings, that's the good part, right? You're lucky. But there are far worse things that are happening, and there are summary executions of people. And I mean, I really hope that at least I hope that the soldiers who came back home, and they had to come back home, they didn't just, you know, discard their weapons, because even just a single AK can save an entire village of people who would otherwise be slaughtered like lambs.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, there is, I was told there were 18,000 Syrian soldiers that just disappeared. So I'm kind of hoping that they're in hiding and preparing to resist. There have been videos put out, for example, by the former 25th Brigade, which were before they were the Tiger Forces. And interestingly, they talk about betrayal by the high command, but that, you know, ultimately, these guys know if they come back and hand in their weapons, they're dead. So for them, at least if they stand and fight, you know, they die a good death rather than just being beaten up, executed, hung, having their head chopped off. You know, all of these kind of summary executions that you're seeing ongoing on a daily basis in all areas of Syria right now.
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense to surrender to these people. I mean, you can't talk to them. You can't reason with them. Like, can we just imagine for a second they couldn't pick anyone better than Jelani to represent the democratic opposition? Like, the best you could do is an Al-Qaeda guy. Of all the like 50,000 people that are essentially like a terrorist army in Syria, you couldn't find a single person that's a bit better, with a bit of a cleaner past than this guy. It tells you like the quality of and the composition of these people, and it's a horrible indicator for everyone. Like, I think I'm thinking about millions of civilized Syrians who were living a normal life. They were the middle class, or they were professors, or they were teachers, and then suddenly you have these illiterate savages who don't know anything, and they're interested only in looting and killing and exerting their power in the most caveman-like way, how are you going to reason with them? How you can't even talk to them? Like, they're not able to hold a 5-minute civilized conversation with you, and I don't see how you could negotiate with them. And the only language they understand is power and force, and that's the only thing you can do against them, I guess.
Drago. You forgot to add money into that, Drago.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that is part of the power equation.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Right.
Well, I guess it can't be helped that we feel sad about these things, because if we don't, then I don't know, we may be just like those people. Okay, so I thank you very much for this moment, and I really trust also what Vanessa has written and said, that it will rise again. And maybe perhaps the second article, just a little bit, tell us about the Malula, because if they're able to have that Aramaic language is still being spoken in that area, imagine what else could happen in the future that will be like, for me, another indicator that they will rise again.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I think right now, the church leaders, I mean, shortly after the stories of the atrocities in Malula came to light, Jolani did his MI6 managed photo op with the spiritual leaders or the Christian leaders inside Syria. But as a friend pointed out to me today, they're the kind of mid-range leaders. They're not the actual church leaders. For example, the Maronites, the leader, is here in Lebanon, and he wasn't present at the meeting. So it was clear this was kind of a photo op to try and quell the rumors of ethnic cleansing from Malula, which of course they'd attempted back in 2013, 2014, when they executed civilians there, when they basically besieged them from the mountain range above the town, and sniped them, killed them, ethnically cleansed them. And the same family that was actually banished from Malula after it was liberated in 2014 is now back in Malula. So you can imagine the revenge driver behind his presence there. And so, I think something like there were 300 families that had returned to Malula since 2014. A large number of them were driven out again this time. And I think at this point, the church has to find, again, the balls to deal with this and actually say this is not acceptable. And when I'm talking about the church, I'm talking about the church globally, because the West is very good at presenting itself as cosmetically defending the Christians in the region. But the reality is they're not. They want the Christians out, because once the Christians go out, you then just have this sectarian war, which they can easily sell to a Western public that it's just Muslims, it's the savage Muslims, in inverted commas, fighting amongst themselves. When the Christians are there, they lose that narrative, because they can't dismiss the Christians, because as I think it was Hartmut said this, they're like us, they can't dismiss that as being a negligible part of the persecution that's ongoing in Syria. So they want them out. And that's why every time that Christians have been displaced from the region, they're offered immediate visas to Canada, to Europe, and so on, to help them get out. So all of this rhetoric in the West that we're defending the Christian communities in the Middle East is nonsense. They want them gone.
Just coming from them, that sounds hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah, it's completely hypocritical. And the church is responsible for that as well, because they're under that political directive to get the Christians out. So of course they're not going to stand there and defend them, or at least put up a fight from a spiritual perspective and say to Jolani, this is not correct. And by the way, when they had that meeting with Jolani, did they ask him about the priests that were kidnapped back in 2013 by HTS and by ISIS? 5. one Catholic and the others were Greek Malachite, were kidnapped by HTS, or as it was then, Nusra Front. Did they bring this up to actually know where the priests were? No, of course they didn't. So this is the hypocrisy of the church itself. And that filters through to their equivalents in Europe, in America, in the UK, in the Vatican. You know, they've never supported the Christians in the Middle East from the very beginning, because the political directive is get them out.
Yeah.
Well,
The
they've
Catholic
been
Church-
destroying.
Yeah.
Like if we look at Iraq, if we look at Syria, if we look at if we look at Kosovo, like the Serbian province, where we have like 1,000 or 15th century old churches and monasteries, they're pretty much destroyed or gone.
And Ukraine.
And we have, or in Ukraine, like wherever NATO puts its boot, then Christianity is gone. Like you can kiss it goodbye. It's insane. Like we have this narrative that, you know, the political West, modern West, defends Christianity, but it couldn't be further from true. Like Christians are, I mean, you have Iran, which is an Islamic republic, which does more to protect its Christian population than the West, which is nominally Christian. It's ridiculous.
Or even the Jewish population, because actually Iran has the second largest Jewish population after Israel. And I visited it when I went to Iran. I visited the Armenian Christians and the Jews, and I actually asked them, like, why didn't you go to Israel? And they said they felt safer in Iran than in Israel. So you know.
Makes sense.
I mean, the Jews were living all across the Middle East, and before Zionism, they were heavily integrated into every society where they lived. I mean, it seems to me that you know, the West always creates these insane extremist versions of whatever, and then implants them somewhere, and then uses it for political whatever geopolitical purposes, and it always includes a bunch of bloodbath, death, and destruction. And I mean, how is it possible that these people were living together for not just centuries but millennia, and then suddenly they just want to kill each other? And we have the same issue in former Yugoslavia. We had people who were living together for centuries, and suddenly everybody hates each other and everybody wants to kill each other. So
exactly. And the same element. KLA was basically Al Qaeda and Albanian warlords, and in fact, the Kosovars are now fighting in Syria.
They're now coming back. They're now people from the Serbian special services are telling me that, you know, right now we have Albanians who are coming back, and this is a big issue for us now. You know, I mean, this is one of the reasons, one of the practical reasons why we were always supportive of Syria here in Serbia. I mean, the government always had its own way of thinking because of NATO pressure and everything, but we were always like personally supportive of Syria and I mean of the Syrian people, because they were fighting against the same people that were fighting us in the 90s. Yeah. And these are like narco terrorists. Like these are not just Islamic radicals. They function thanks to prostitution and narco trade and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And these are the worst of the worst people you can imagine. Like wherever they go, you know that the mess is coming. Like they function based on all the bad things for any society. That's prostitution, especially forced prostitution, drug trade, arms trade,
organ trafficking,
terrorism. Yeah, all sorts of trafficking. Anything illegal you can imagine, these people will do it. And wherever they go, and wherever society like accepts them as refugees, well, even though they're not really refugees, then there's an uptick in all these things. So, I mean, I don't know. It's really, this is why, you know, I feel sad for the Syrian people, because they're going to be the ones who are going to have to go through all this after living through 14 or almost 15 years of an invasion. I mean, not a civil war, but an invasion from all sides.
Yeah.
Thank you, Drago. Vanessa, how's your dogs? And maybe that would be a good ending. I know you only had one, and you left many.
She's asleep on the bed behind me. I don't know if anyone can see.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And how about the rest of your dog family that you left?
Oh God, yeah, that was the worst, the absolute pits. Apart from I had to leave everything, but there I've managed to rehome all of them except for two. So, and not one of them I will probably bring here if I can. And the pit will probably go to a new home in the next week or so. But yeah, that was really the worst. That was the worst part of it, was just leaving them behind. And I only had her. Like trying to get through the border was quite exciting. So the poor thing, because we had them shooting around the house all night. They tried to break the door down in the morning. Thank God I had the dogs, because that's what basically put them off. And then when we left, of course, the border was kind of like Mad Max. They were just looting everything, firing, fighting amongst themselves. So to a degree, they were so focused on the looting, they weren't actually looking at me driving through the border, and there was no one to stamp my passport, nothing. But I was very lucky. I had a driver that didn't give up, because it was very difficult to get through, but he just kept sort of U-turning and coming back another way and ramming them out of the way, and we just got through somehow. So yeah, we were very, very lucky.
And for those who wants to support Vanessa through Patreon, are you able to have access to your money for spending?
Yeah, no, it's actually easier here than it was in Syria. Syria was always difficult because of sanctions and so on, but here it's a bit easier. So no, it's fine. Substack is probably the main one that people can follow my work anyway.
It's okay. Well, thank you. And so anyone else?
Well, no, Vanessa, thank you for your courage. Thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you for educating us about what's happening in the world. You don't get that anywhere on any TV station in America. It's just, the big joke in my family is the TVs are dark until we turn on Netflix. And we have to be careful what we watch on Netflix. I mean, it's really
exactly.
I grew up on a Sunday morning, we would have about 12 papers and 6 magazines and all kinds. We would read everything, The Economist. I mean, we read everything. We knew everything that was going on in the world, right? If I can show you a picture of my dining room table, there's not one newspaper on the dining table, not one magazine, not anything. If we're not getting it from sources like yourself, we don't even listen to it, because we understand geopolitics. We understand regional and local politics. We understand what our government engages in every day. I think what's happening in the world, people are waking up. I just really believe people in some weird way are paying more attention to what's happening in the world, even though they've been blocked out of seeing it and hearing it and feeling it. But because of shows like this and what Grace does by bringing the world together, have a global conversation, it's very helpful. Just the 12 things you laid out, and you look at from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, we're back right where we started. You know, we're right back here again, this ongoing cycle of murder and mayhem and genocide and control and power. And I think at the end of the day, we just have to say enough. And I think the American people have to say enough, because this whole branding that we're fighting for America's sovereignty or America's right to be a democracy is the biggest bullshit I've heard. I'm just so sick of it. I'm like, guys, this has nothing to do with democracy. This has something to do about the military-industrial complex. This has something to do with corruption and the corruption in our government. It has something to do with several families controlling every aspect of our lives. It has something to do with the central bank. I think Americans in some small way, especially coming out of COVID, are a lot more attuned to what's happening in the world. Now, you still have a lot of my patriot friends that anytime they say the word terrorism, like, oh my God, it's Iran, it's Iraq, I'm like, you can't be that damn crazy, you know? So that's my little 2 cents before we close up.
Thank you for that.
How about you, Drago? Because I know you love Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. It's I can only imagine how hard it was for her to go through all that. And I survived wars. I know how scary it can be,
Mm.
and but I know it's especially scary for women and children. I was a child when it happened, so I can only imagine how scary it was. And still, it's impressive that you still are pushing back and fighting against what's going on. And of course, this is something that it's extremely commendable. And I think it should be an inspiration for all of us. And for people who think, oh, I can't do this because I might lose my job, or I might get a salary reduction, or my promotion is not going to happen. Well, that's essentially the definition of cowardice, in my opinion. And if we had less of it, we wouldn't be having all these problems that we have today. I think we need more courage, definitely.
Yeah,
because
I agree, and I was kind of laughing with a friend of mine who was actually formerly in the army, and we were talking about the fact that because it did my head in having my house surrounded by these terrorists for the whole night, and I was completely on my own. I said, but I've been on the front lines, but on the front lines, I was always with the National Defense, or I was with the army. There was always like a military presence there protecting you, or not directly protecting me, but protecting the area where I was. So even though we were under attack and we were being fired at and mortars were coming in and rockets were coming in, I never felt this kind of naked fear that everyone was feeling on this night, because there was all the confusion. There was the fact that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of these guys just like roaming the streets, firing in the air and firing at the houses. Israel started bombing, like it was just the end of the world had just started, and there was nothing you could do. And so there was a real sense of powerlessness, even from people that previously had been fighting against the invasion for the last 14 years. Even for them, there was a feeling of like, well, what do we do? We can't stop them, and they can do what they we And of course, we knew what they were capable of. That was the other thing, because we'd seen it already for the 14 years of them carrying out hideous sectarian massacres and executions and rapes and so on. So we knew what they're capable of. Like you said, they're monsters, and you can't reason with them. So what are you going to do if they decide to come into the house, or they decide to, this was the thing. So it was dealing with the unknown. But when they did actually try and break into the house, it kicks in, and then I was just yelling at them. And I remember being on the phone to a friend, and she was saying, "Can you find a kitchen knife?" I was like, "What am I going to do with a kitchen knife?"
Even if you have like an AK, there's like 5 of them. You're gonna run out of ammo.
Exactly. And I'd probably shoot my own foot off if I tried to.
Didn't you bring out your Arabic words for get out or something?
Yeah, no, I did. Like I was on another call to another friend. He was like, "Okay, say this like in Arabic. Don't speak in English." So there was a degree of comedy about the whole thing, but not necessarily at the time. But yeah, I think one thing that as human beings, I think we discover our courage when we're actually facing the enemy. The difficult time is the unknown, is that anxiety time when we're imagining what the enemy might be and we're imagining what we might have to face. That's the difficult time. But if you can somehow override that and not worry about it until you have to face it, because when you face it, you find the courage, because something kicks in, some instinct kicks in, which is a kind of self-protection. I don't know if you found that, Drago, in former Yugoslavia, but something kicks into you when you're actually facing it, that you deal with it.
And Hartmut, any?
Yeah, that's exactly how.
Go ahead, Drago. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that that's exactly how Vanessa explained it. Uh, for us, it was the same. I mean, I remember when they were shooting at us, but I also remember when they were dropping the bombs, and that was actually scarier because you can duck when somebody
Mm.
shoots at you. If it's a bomb or a missile or I don't know a rocket or a mortar, artillery or something, you can just pray to God it doesn't hit you because you have no idea where it's gonna. When you
Mm.
while you hear at the time I didn't know that, but if you can hear the whistling sound of a mortar, you're safe,
Mm.
but when you can hear it, then that's the dangerous part. But the point is
Yeah.
that makes it even scarier because you don't know if it's going to happen to you. So the sounds of war and the this feeling that you have that it might be the end for you at any moment. This is something that changes every person, no matter who you are. And the only good thing about it is that you become truly aware of how fragile your life is. And I think the good thing about it also is that you become more brave. Like you become far braver than you were before because you have no other choice. Otherwise, you can just roll over and die.
Mm.
And Hartmut, you want to say a few words?
Well, yes, of course.
Just
Well,
briefly.
yes, I appreciate really your work, Vanessa, because we are in our situation. We are in a race between propaganda and truth, like it
Mm.
was in the military dictatorship in Greece from
Mm.
1967 to 1974. The people are journalists who had the courage to expose the cruelty of the military dictatorship uh, in Greece, and this
I think you're.
the for the coming European Union. Yeah.
Thank you, Hartmut. I think your
And
wife.
for this reason is the race between propaganda and truth is the most important thing. And this is the reason to speed of the truth.
Mm.
Thank you. Thank you,
Oh,
Hartmut.
okay.
Yes. So anyway, make sure, guys, viewers and audience and everyone else, resonate. This podcast resonates to you or someone else. Please share it and do follow Vanessa in the Telegram channel, Vanessa Billy. That's the name. And of course, Drago has his Telegram channel, Observe Funhouse, and also the infobricks.org. And Vanessa's, of course, Substack. Okay, so just search that and. Kevin also, you could always follow Kevin in the Facebook and Instagram. And yeah, I do have my channel in the Telegram as well. Okay, so just type in Quantum Nurse Grace Asagra and you'll find me there. So thank you all, and please support Vanessa. We'll keep her alive,
Hopefully.
And all of you there, be alive. Kevin.
You're one brave woman.
No, thank you all, and thank you, Grace, for organizing this. I always enjoy coming on and chatting with you guys.
Yeah, and by the way, that Dr. Reza Jan, he that we had last week, he does know you. He follows you. It's just that his brother passed away 2 days ago, so he couldn't.
Oh,
Now,
I'm sorry.
I don't know what happened, but he passed away. And Dr. Reza is an Iranian living in UK, but he just moved out of UK for his family because he knew he didn't want UK to really dictate how he would raise his children. So he wishes to meet you again someday. So
yeah, that would be lovely. I'd love to. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.